Hi folks, this screencast is going to cover content for number 2 and number 4 in your note guide. So we're going to just skip over number 3 during the screencast. So we're going to be doing that in class with a reading and discussion. And let's go ahead and get started. So, we're looking first at the scientific revolution and the ideas that come out of the scientific revolution about observation, reason, proof, inductive reasoning, deductive reasoning. All of these shape the time and influence people not in science. So philosophers, people who think about how to live a good life and also how a government should be run and how society should be run. So in the quote here from our friend John Locke, you see that bridge between science and political philosophy, or ideas about how government should be run. So he describes this state of nature as a law that governs it. This law of nature obliges that no one should harm another in his natural rights to life, liberty, and property. And what's underlined here is that language that makes it seem like rights and figuring out rights is a science. It's not based on faith. It's not based on what God told you or your relationship with God. It's not based on even really like loyalty or like Confucian ideas. It is a state of nature, and that's very specifically drawing on that influence of scientists at this time looking around a lot at nature and what they could observe. In fact, my major in college was political science, so that notion that there's a science to this thinking. All right, I'll stop talking for a moment and let you read on your own these 4 bullet points. Go ahead and pause the screencast so you can have a little extra time to read them on your own. All right, so we looked at this with the slideshow in class on Monday or Tuesday, but just to give you a sense of the time frame. So, like with the economics, there's not a hard and fast start to this, but if there was a benchmark you could use, it would probably be the death of King Louis XIV, because after he passes away in France, where a lot of the Enlightenment ideas are coming from, you stop having a king that can command as much loyalty. Like, Louis had a lot of power. He had absolute power in a lot of ways, as we looked at, but he was able to win the people over, and he was able to win the nobles over. And then after him, we see less and less of that, so that you have kings still trying to rule, but not with that support. And when they're not being supported, you get people coming in with other ideas of how things could go. Like, let's think about this logically, let's be rational, let's take this apart like it was a science experiment and figure out what could be better. This is going to eventually bring us up to the French Revolution. Side note, it's the American Revolution that happens first and tests out a lot of these ideas of the Enlightenment. So if these ideas feel very natural to you, it's because you grew up in a country based on these ideas. Our democracy grows out of it. Okay, now an intellectual movement is a very abstract way of describing like a philosophy. What that means by saying intellectual movement is it's not just one person thinking it, it's ideas that catch on, that spread. So there may be a philosopher who first puts it into writing, but then it catches on with other philosophers and people sitting around talking about it. That's why it's called an intellectual movement. And there are a couple of these big ideas, big philosophies, political philosophies of the Enlightenment. I create little visuals to help you remember them. The first one is skepticism. You may be familiar with parts of this term, skeptic or being skeptical. It means questioning. And it doesn't necessarily mean criticizing, though it can. So skepticism is fundamentally like a questioning and a curiosity, but it can also sometimes have a negative connotation of criticizing or not liking what's there. So I put Curious George so you would remember it's not always negative. Deism. Now, our founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson among them, were deists. So let's see if we can better understand this. Deism in a world where the church is still really important is reconceiving God as not someone who makes your crops fail or who gets your child sick. It's not that personal a relationship with God. You can pray to God, you can believe in God, but God's not hanging over our shoulders determining every move and making sure we get the touchdown instead of the opposing team. So deists believe in God, but as a creator who maybe intervened to form the planets and form everything on Earth, but doesn't come here daily to check on how things are going. So Voltaire, who was an Enlightenment thinker, his quote here is, "I cannot imagine how the clockwork of the universe can exist without a clockmaker." Very much still attributing that there's an unknowable, that there is a deity, a force that's beyond our ability to understand, beyond the power of men, but not one that's daily involved in our lives. The next step is atheism. Now, I told you, in Renaissance, not atheism. Secular ideas that are outside the church, not everything has to do with the church, but you thought about those things during the week and you still went to the church on the weekend. Reformation, still lots of God. It's not until we get into the 1700s, so now we're like 250 years past where we started this course, 250 years past the start of the Renaissance, that people start playing with the idea that God may not exist. So you do see it in Enlightenment thought. It becomes more prominent in the 1800s, where Marx is saying not only does God not exist, but you're a fool if you believe in him or it. But you do have it introduced in the Enlightenment. So we can put atheism on the map, the notion that God may not exist, from about mid-1700s. And then the last one is cultural relativism. And yeah, I did just steal this slide from another history teacher off the internet. But I absolutely love this little commentary cartoon. So take a minute to read that and read the quote here, and then I'll talk about it. So I'll actually do this in real time. And pause if you need more time for that. I'm going to go ahead now and say a little bit about this. In the 1700s, you had European philosophers who were aware of African nations, who were aware of Native American nations, and who had always been aware of Chinese and, Asian nations. So they have some appreciation for the fact that there are other ways of doing things besides the European. So this fits in our theme of Europe and the world. And in some ways, cultural relativism is tolerance and acceptance of different ideas. Like, they have a different way of doing things, and I can respect that. But I want to be real clear that most of the cultural relativism from philosophers of this time is still heavily Eurocentric. Like, it may say, oh, they have a different way of doing things because they weren't educated the way we were. There's an implied feeling that the European way is still sort of the best, but a curiosity of like how those backwards people do things. So it's not woke. We don't want to confuse it with that. It's not, what would you say? It's tolerant, it's not accepting. So it's tolerant that those people have their own ways, but it's not accepting them as equal. Okay, here are 4 people who we are going to use to represent these 4 ideas I just explained. Kant for skeptics, Holbach for atheists, Diderot for deist, that's probably the easiest one to remember, and cultural relativism from Christian Wolff. And they were all writers and stuff. Diderot is credited for putting together the encyclopedia, the first encyclopedia, which, if you remember encyclopedias, maybe from elementary school, they have everything in them. That's where the term Wikipedia comes from. I'm going to give you a bunch of different philosophies, and you're going to try and match them. So you can play along if you want, see how well you understand. Okay, here's the first one. Which of the 4 intellectual movements is this one? I'm not going to read all of them, but I'll start off by reading this one. Of all the systems that ever were invented, there is no more injurious, harmful to man, none more repugnant or disgusting to reason than this thing called Christianity. Too absurd for belief, too impossible to convince, and too inconsistent for practice, it produces only fanatics. As an engine of power, it serves the purpose of despotism. That's a word you'll hear a couple times this unit. That means like an unreasonable monarch. And as a means of wealth, it serves the greed of priests, sort of like Luther's complaint. But so far as the good of man in general, it leads to nothing. The Christian theory is little else than the idolatry of the ancient mythologists. Oh, wow. So now calling Christianity like on the level of myth. Accommodated to the purposes of power and revenue. The power and revenue of the monarchs and the popes. And it yet remains to reason and philosophy to abolish its fraud. So reason and philosophy over Christian theory. Which one of those is it? Is it skeptic, deist, atheist, or cultural relativism? We're going to go with atheist. Yes, this is an out-and-out condemnation of Christianity and God. If you guessed that correctly, yay! All right. I will let you read this one to yourself. Go ahead and pause and take a moment to read it. All right, if you guessed deist, you are correct. Deist because, I'll go back here in case some of you cheated and didn't really read it. I live very happily with atheists. I believe in God. Superstition is more injurious to God than atheism. God gives us reason. So there's a God here. It's a God who gives us reason. So still a presence of God. But not, you have to convert to Christianity or you'll be going to hell. All right, I'll read this one. Since the ancient Chinese did not know of God, the creator of the world, they had no natural religion. All right, well, if he's talking about the Chinese, it's already cultural relativism. If he's talking about someplace besides Europe, it's cultural relativism. But let's stick with it. Sorry, spoiler. That is why they could only count on the laws of nature, science, and indeed because they were free from the intolerance of religion, they were able to practice virtue. Perhaps I will sometime find occasion to bring the moral and political teachings of the Chinese into the form of a science, so the harmony of their teachings can show itself clearly to the people of Prussia. So there's like definitely a curiosity here and a tolerance for Chinese doing things differently, but I feel like there's a little bit of an arrogance that it's, maybe I'm reading into it too much, because he does say he wants to bring it to the people of Prussia. You can argue with me about that in class if you think that he was being accepting of it and not just tolerant. So we have Wolff there for the cultural relativist. So let's see, this is going to be skeptic. Let's see if we can find evidence of why it's skeptic. Take a minute to look at this and see if you can find for yourself what proves this is skeptic. All right, if you notice that he is criticizing people who just believe without arguing, and that like admonition that you shouldn't argue, you should just have faith, he's saying that as a criticism of those people. if you caught that, that's good. If you got down to like the third from the bottom, that not being able to argue restricts freedom, then that is the skeptic thing. Let me argue, let me question. All right, and that is Kant in his nice little wig. Okay, so hopefully that gave you a little bit better sense of these 4 different intellectual movements. All of them are seen as aspects of Enlightenment thought. They all bring new ideas of how to use reason and be rational in approaching the society around you, religion, government. Okay, these ideas spread. So now we're moving into number 4 in your note guide. The Republic of Letters. Republic of Letters is referring to the fact that a lot of these ideas spread through correspondence or letters that people write to each other. If you're not familiar with that, letters is what there was before email. People actually wrote things on paper, sealed it with wax, and there wasn't really an efficient postal system always, but they would have it delivered by their footmen, like that, from like your house to the, these people didn't usually live that far apart, and they deliver them. So letters, sharing the idea through letters. A republic of letters is like the catchy little phrase that they gave to it, which meant that long before the government had switched over from monarchy to a republic, there was already this notion of what a republic could look like through people spreading the ideas. So kind of like a hashtag or like a Twitter thread that's going, similar to how the Black Lives Matter movement got started, first through online presence, like an online presence, social media. That's kind of like what they mean by Republic of Letters. And then it takes to the streets with the Black Lives Matter movement. And we will see that in France also. What you want to note here with this chart is that the Republic of Letters depends on an increase of literacy, which there was, which is great because now you're picturing all of these French people in much larger numbers reading these interesting ideas from Enlightenment philosophers, or philosophes is the French word for philosopher. But just like today, just because there's good knowledge out there, that doesn't mean that's what people want to read. So the increase in literacy, yes, there's more people reading Kant and Voltaire and Locke, but there's also people reading romance and trash. Yes, that was popular in the 1700s also. So the increase in literacy is partly people reading these, what you would call like more intellectual or highbrow things, but also a lot of people like reading the junk, the lowbrow stuff, because, it's a little more fun to read. All right, so, I apologize. Look at all those commas. They're just there for no reason. My apologies for that. But the Enlightenment ideas also spread through direct meetings, like things people used to do before COVID. So what would it look like in the 1700s? And again, a lot of this is France. So the words are all sounding French. Salon refers to like a very large living room. These were mostly wealthier people, and so they would have people over to their house with these huge living rooms, and they would sit around and discuss ideas. So if that looks more like a meeting hall to you, that's because these are very large estates, and they would be hosting parties. Now, hosting parties in a noble class is something that's open to women. So the women could be the hostesses of the party. This is where women can play a role in the Enlightenment. It's a private space. It's in the home. It's not public like serving the king or serving the government. It's this private space, and women have often been afforded more power in a private space. So the salons would often be called together as a party and then would go into these intellectual discussions. And some of the prominent women involved in this really became, political activists as time goes on. And these women are referred to as salonières, which again is a French word. Now, if you weren't fancy enough to be invited to their salons or their big houses, that doesn't mean that you weren't also engaging in these ideas. So we see coffee houses, Parisian coffee houses, but even in the countryside, coffee houses or pubs being a place where ideas were shared. In addition to the personal letters that were written, pamphlets were written. So if you remember, like, maybe you studied Thomas Paine in 8th grade and like his Common Sense or the Federalist Papers, these were all ideas that were written and then mass produced through printing press and spread around. And they weren't full books, they were like shorter, things that were easier, cheaper to produce and for more people to be able to buy. So you would see these discussions going on in coffee houses around the countryside. Again, mostly talking about France. You might see it like in other places in Western Europe too. What else do I want to say about this? I think that's good. So, I did say women had a more prominent role, but that doesn't mean people were excited about that. Here we have a Enlightenment thinker who believed a lot in Locke's ideas of natural rights and even advocated for there being democracy and not having absolute monarchy. What does he have to say about women? It follows that woman is made specially to please men. Oh God, this sounds like that Renaissance guy who wanted to hide his books from his women. 300 years later, and we're still here. All right, it follows that woman is made specially to please men. Thus, the whole education of women should relate to men, to please men, to be useful to men. Well, he isn't hiding the books. He's saying she can be educated, but only in ways that make her useful and of service to men. The quest for truth and principles in the sciences is not within the capabilities of women. Well, that is definitely something that they would have said during the Renaissance. They are for the sex which has more strength of mind. So I know that made it sound like they are for the sex, like they are for having sex. That's not what he's saying. He's saying that truth and principles are ideas that are for the gender that has more strength of mind, meaning men. Woman is weak and sees nothing outside the house. Now remember, I did just tell you that the private space inside the house would be a way for a woman to act like she wasn't contradicting this idea of Rousseau, but still like have a sneaky way of wielding more power and influence. And we will see this in the 1700s, and we'll see it during the French Revolution also, where women want to have more say and are more engaged in these ideas. All right, just like we had in the Renaissance, we had, I'm forgetting her name, Christiane, I forget her last name. But anyways, she was a Renaissance woman who spoke out against Bruni and those guys who were saying women had no rights or no capabilities. Similarly, you know, there will always be women who find ways to educate themselves and then speak their mind about the fact that they are capable of being educated. So Mary Wollstonecraft was one of these women. She herself was educated, an author, philosophe in her own right. A philosopher, because she's English, not French. And here is what she has to say to Rousseau. This is her clap back. I have observed more girls than Rousseau has, meaning I'm actually studying the evidence, which is a double burn, because she is using the Enlightenment philosophy of the time that's all about like observing and making hypotheses, the scientific method. So she's using the scientific method against Rousseau. I have observed more girls than Rousseau, and will dare to say that a girl whose spirit has not been dampened by society will always be full of energy. So what she's saying is like, unless a girl's been told to act weak and stupid, she's got a fair amount of energy and vim and vigor. I'm fully persuaded that if girls were allowed to take sufficient exercise and not be confined to enclosed room till their muscles are weak and their powers of thought destroyed, women could do anything. Now, this is an interesting statement about the context. She's not saying every girl I've observed is as strong and capable as men. She's saying, yes, you actually have made women weaker, but it's because you don't let them go out and exercise, you don't let them think about any things. So if you give me evidence of women who aren't as capable, it's because you made them that way. So that's different in 1792 than what we would say in 2020 about why women should be seen as equal. We would say we are equal, not that we need to be given a chance to show we can be equal. All right, let's finish the quote. Educate women like men, and the more power women will have. This is the very thing I aim for. But I do not wish women to have power over men, but over themselves. So, trying to reduce any threat that men may feel that women would overpower them, just that women want independence of themselves. But it's such an interesting sentence, right? Because, gosh, even back then in 1792, men were worried that women would take over and that they'd be feminazis. But it's also interesting because that last one, but over themselves, that's not nothing. She's asking for women to have autonomy and be able to own property and be able to direct their destiny, not just have to be married off. So that's actually a really big request, but it's understated. You know, it reminds me of Ruth Bader Ginsburg's quote from 50 years ago that says, you know, women can be equal if men will just take their foot off the necks of women. So some similarities there, some differences in what was hoped for gender equality, but some similarities. All right. So a little bit about race. Yes, there was cultural relativism, but there was also people who didn't believe in it at all. Take a moment to notice the chiaroscuro in this portrait of Hume with the black background and the lit face. I'll give you a minute just to pause this screencast, read this. You will see what you would expect, a more traditional racist view of the inequality and aptitude of Africans. I will go ahead and move on to the next slide, but I am going to assume you're going to take the time to pause this and read it on your own. All right. Well, how I want to do this. I think I want to tell you why this earthquake's important, and then we'll go back to watch the video. So, in 1755, there was a horrible earthquake in Lisbon, Portugal. It's the capital of Portugal. And normally we don't study natural disasters in history, which is a shame because it is an interesting aspect of history all unto itself. But the reason why we're looking at this here is that it is the kind of natural disaster, especially before you have seismologists and the ability to understand why an earthquake happens, because earthquakes aren't weather, they come out of nowhere, and they definitely seem like an act of God. So in the midst of deism and atheism comes a very unexplainable natural disaster, this earthquake. And it brings back feelings of superstition or religious devotion from even some of the Enlightenment philosophers. In particular, I gotta think, because the earthquake happens on a Sunday morning, and a lot of the people who were good Christians were in church and got killed when the buildings collapsed. Okay, so that's the context. Now, if you want to stick with us to see the actual destruction, you can do that. If you're not as interested, that's basically the end of your note guide terms. Let's see if I can get this going. All right, hopefully the buffering won't be too long. Oh wait, I could pause it and catch you guys up in a second.
Of Portugal, and one of the oldest cities in Europe. But today, remnants of its ancient glories are hard to find. 300 years ago, a very different Lisbon stood on this site. A gilded city at the center of a world empire. Until the day disaster struck. Moments before 9:30 a.m. on November 1st, 1755, a sudden sliding movement between two gigantic tectonic plates occurs. The result? A massive magnitude 8.5 earthquake, one of the most powerful in modern European history. 150 miles from the epicenter, the full power of the earthquake strikes Lisbon. Nobody knows exactly how many people were crushed in those first terrifying moments, but time and place would conspire to seal the fate of tens of thousands. Survivors flee towards open ground down by the Tagus River. 150 miles offshore, the earthquake has displaced trillions of gallons of water. It results in a tsunami, which takes less than 40 minutes to reach Lisbon. The tsunami kills hundreds, but in a cruel twist of fate, just before the earthquake strikes, thousands of candles are lit in Lisbon to celebrate the Feast of All Saints. As the waters recede, it's not enough to extinguish the gathering flames that spread and engulf the city. After earthquake, tsunami, and fire, Lisbon, one of Europe's richest seaports, has been transformed. No more a city of gold, it has become a repository of charred and blackened bones.
I like the cheery little music they put on immediately after Charred and Blackened Bones. Okay, so, yeah, and that's amazing. I mean, we live in earthquake country. We understand, like, to be 150 miles from the epicenter and still have that much effect. Now, no, their buildings were built earthquake-proof, but still, it's something. Alrighty, that's it. I will see you in class.